pull up this presentation. All right, I always got to move my stuff around a little bit. Where's my presenter? There we go. So, tree stewards training, tree planting, and tree care. Like I said, the nitty gritty. As a reminder, everything we're going to go over today, you can find in these two resources. Really great resources. If you haven't already accessed them, you can look them up. We can connect you with them. Really helpful. And I'll be taking some images directly from these resources for this lecture. So, to start off, when we talk about types of trees, we define what type of tree we're going to get to plant, whether it's an urban tree planting, a street tree planting specifically in your backyard, whatever. We don't do it by its height. We don't do it by its diameter. We do it by how it's packaged. So the three most common ways that you're ever going to get a tree are, we call it B&B, balled and burlap. This is kind of the most traditional. It's what we used to see a lot, but it's going out of fashion a little bit. We have containerized, which is like you would see probably at a lot of the places like Home Depot or Lowe's, where it's coming in a plastic pot. And then we have bare root. There's no soil, there's no packaging, it's just the tree. So on this bare root, when you have a bare root, a lot of times it's for a very small tree. Occasionally it'll be for a larger tree. And there's actually a lot of success we'll talk about later with planting bare root larger trees, but they're much harder to get and they're much more expensive. All right, so those are our three main types. What are some of the disadvantages and advantages of each if you're ordering? So B&B, balled and burlapped, like I said, one of the most common. You've probably seen a lot of images and visuals of this in the past. They're dug out of the ground. They were grown in a field, usually like a farm field. So they're accumulated to wild soil. Because of that, the soil that you are probably going to put them in a yard, a park, a neighborhood, something like that, they're well adapted to already. They don't really require as much water as some of the others because they have that soil. It's going to hold that water. And they have fewer roots that you're going to have to trim unnecessarily. They haven't overgrown with their roots. They're also available in larger sizes. If you're doing a large planting, as you can see in the photos here, anything over 6 feet in height, you're usually going to lean towards getting balled and burlapped because that's just too hard to grow them in containers and they can't ship. That being said, as we talked about in the past, and we'll talk about again, when you plant a large tree, it's going to spend a long time focusing just on its root base. So if you plant a tree that's 5 inches tall, and beside it you plant a tree that's 5 feet tall, at the end of 5 years, that 5-inch tall tree is probably going to be the same height as that 5-foot tall tree because it can give all that energy into growth more equally. Where that other tree is basically in shock, the larger tree. So you put a larger tree in the ground because it's immediate satisfaction. You know exactly what you're getting. People like to see it. And so we do that a lot in our street plantings and urban plantings. But overall, the tree does grow slower for the first 5 to 10 years. The disadvantages, as you can see here, it does shock the tree, like I said. They are more expensive if they're larger. They're very heavy and difficult to move because that soil can be very wet. And they're mostly limited to a specific time of year when they can come in and out of the ground. You really don't want to do this in summer or spring. You want to do it when they're dormant. So really mostly in the winter and the barrier seasons, the beginning of fall and spring and things like that, where it's still cold and the tree is dormant. Some of the large sizes you can see here, if you're doing those large plantings, that you're going to have these balled and burlapped that are really quite large. And then on the outside of them, they actually have metal cages that are holding them together for shipment. And we'll talk more about shipping. I assume no one on this call will have, like you see here on the picture on the left, a really nice, tractor or backhoe to plant these things. But if you do, that's usually the weight that, that's how heavy they are. So they're not the tree that you usually choose for your average, small planting that you're going to be leading. The much more common tree that all of our volunteers plant are containerized trees. These are what you're going to see. They're becoming more and more common too. They have a higher success rate in the industry. Anytime I'm planting an urban tree, I think this year we're planting around 700 to 800 urban trees at the Alliance, and we're doing all containerized stock. They come with all of their roots pretty much intact. Sometimes they, sneak through those drain holes at the bottom, but they're coming with all of their roots intact. They're available in a lot of different sizes, from as small as 3 gallons, usually being one of the smallest in this industry, all the way up to 15 gallons being the standard large in the industry in size. And that's once again the size of the bucket or the pot that they're in. They're also one of the easiest ones to move around to transport. Disadvantages, as any of you gardeners know, they're not growing in the best soil. It's usually filled with roots. It's usually a quick growing medium, not necessarily similar to the soil you're going to be planting in. It's going to be things like wood chips and fertilizers. They require more water to get established because their roots are used to getting watered very regularly in those small pots. And they might be root bound. And I would actually change might be or potentially root bound to they will be root bound. And we will talk about what to do with root bound trees. So there are a few different versions of what these look like. You see on the left, we have a 3-5 gallon size. That's kind of one of the really typical sizes. I would say 5 and 7 are the two standard sizes that we most often go with. Then you have a smaller one. We call this a plug. This is what we do a lot of our larger plantings with our nurseries are via plugs, whether it's a bare root plug or whether it's a containerized plug. This is just a small little sapling. You can see this thumb here for size comparison. And then on the right-hand side, this is just to demonstrate we don't have that soil in our backyard, right? Especially here in Maryland. Excuse me, up in Pennsylvania, Cumberland. Especially up in Pennsylvania, you're not going to get this type of loamy soil usually unless you're planting in a richly composted bed that's been amended. So it's going to take it some time to get used to where it's going to grow. So those are some of the downsides of a container. Last, excuse me, we have bare root. Bare root, as it sounds. You can see this photo on the right. It is just a stick. These are the classic trees that you get from like the Arbor Day Foundation, in the mail, bare roots. They're easy to ship. Advantages, they have a lot of vigor. Vigor is a specific term in arborist culture and forestry. That's the potential to grow. So they have a lot of vigor. They have a lot of potential to grow. They take a really small amount of water to get established. They're inexpensive. They're easy to handle. You can do a planting of 500 of those, and they're only going to take up about enough space to hold them under your arm. When we do plantings in the thousands, it only takes up the back of one pickup truck with all of these. So we can get 2,000 trees in the ground with all of those trees in the back of a pickup truck. Obviously, the much larger size, you can get maybe 5. Disadvantages: low impact visually. That's the biggest reason we don't use these very often. One of the two biggest reasons we don't use them very often for urban plantings. People don't know they're a tree, and they don't feel like they're getting their money's worth. If they donated or if they volunteered, that tree just looks like a stick in the ground for all of its dormant season. It's very easy to get damaged if it's in an urban area, kicked, stepped on, hit by a bike. Even if you put protective filters around it, it's more vulnerable. Similar to what we talked about earlier to the bare root, these ones you really only plant in their dormant season, so when it's cold. And these are the ones that we mostly use in our reforestation. Like I said, if we're doing 2,000 trees in a day, these are the types we use. We don't do smaller trees. So when we're planting an entire forest, we use the bare roots. You've probably seen this driving along the roads. This is a reforestation project, separate from the urban tree conversation we've been having throughout most of this lecture, but also, a really common way to plant trees. When we're doing a reforestation project and we're doing hundreds of thousands of trees, we're planting them in these tree tubes with a stake. So they have a long time to mature and grow before they're going to be subject to predation or damage by weather or other animals. So if you've seen this, this is a reforestation planting. So there are 3 common places to get trees if you're working with your neighborhood or your town. The obvious one is plant nurseries. There are probably many around you. You can Google them. You can ask your local extension office. Any local nursery probably has some trees. Some of them focus specifically on trees. Just south of you guys a little bit, there are Schatz Nursery and Clear Ridge Nursery. They're private, and you can get a lot of trees from them. If you're getting things like bare roots, we usually get most of our bare roots actually from really large tree plantations and nurseries down in the Carolinas. But we have some details on where you can find them later. And then also we have government nursery, which a lot of people don't know about. Maryland has a government nursery. Pennsylvania has several government and research institution-led nurseries that you can get trees from your state. Sometimes counties even have their own nurseries. So look up your municipality, look up your state, forestry board, and you can get trees from there as well. Sometimes at a deeply discounted rate, sometimes for free, depending on the planting you're doing and if it fits with their different goals. So government nurseries can be an absolutely great resource. And then we have nonprofit organizations like Arbor Day Foundation and American Forests. There are other ones. One down here is called Claggett Farm. They grow their own trees just to get them out, so they get a lot of trees out in the world. Here at the Alliance, we actually have a lot of volunteers grow trees for us. They sign up for a tree growing program. Oh, I saw Wendy raise her hand. So yeah, we have volunteers who are growing trees, and then we use those trees to get them in the ground. Not a registered nonprofit, but growing them with us as a nonprofit. So very grateful to our volunteers. So ask your neighbors. Someone might be growing some trees that you can use. When you get your trees, whether you're getting them from the nursery or whether they're getting shipped to you by a nursery, you always want to inspect them. And there are a few things you want to inspect them for, just like any other product. You want to look at the crown, make sure it's at least 60%. If it's deciduous, 75% for evergreen, that it's taking up a healthy amount of the tree. If it's way too small and it's just taking up like 10%, it's probably been topped by a deer or something or damaged, and it won't do well. You want to make sure it has one central leader. That's called apical or apical growth. One main growth stem coming up, if you remember that from our early lectures. So you want to have one healthy growth stem if you can. None of these are deal breakers necessarily, but these are things you want to look at for the best success. You want to make sure there aren't wounds on the bark, that it doesn't have things like we've talked about before, like a fungal infection or cracks or damage from an equipment or shipping. The trunk should be centered in the pot. The soil should be, it should move independently in the root ball. And there shouldn't be more than 4 inches of soil over the roots. You don't want it to be completely buried. So you look at your stock to make sure you're getting something good. The same thing you do when you go to the grocery store, right? You don't want to get a banana that's already brown and bruised, unless you're making banana bread. You don't want to get an avocado that's already brown and bruised, right? You want to get one that's looking good. So you do the same thing for your tree stock. When you're getting, as we talked about, containerized, we'll talk a lot about containerized since it's the main one that we use. You're looking for things like you can see here on the left where there's been a basal scar. This tree was damaged, and as a result, it's also sprouting from the bottom. So this tree is already going to start off life with a big disadvantage. On the right, you're looking for bad shapes in trees. So this curve isn't going to be corrected. It's not going to correct itself at this age. It's going to be bad structurally. It's going to be susceptible to damage from storms and wind. And any private nursery I've ever bought from, you can say, I don't want this tree. This is why. Never had a problem with them returning it or replacing it. So you're looking for damages like this. You want a nice, straight, healthy looking tree. How do you transport these trees to keep them healthy? If you've ever seen a truck driving down the road with trees, blowing in the wind like this, like someone at a Grateful Dead concert waving their arms or something, that's not good. You want it to be lying down. You want it to be relaxed. The same way, if you're flying, right, on an international flight, you want to lie down in a nice first class seat. I assume, I've never been in one, and take a nap. The trees want to do the same thing. Tie and wrap the branches up in a blanket to prevent them from getting damaged by the wind or other projectiles in the air as they're driving. Because if you're driving at 80 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, that would be a storm that would, take out most young growth. So think of it like you're creating a storm. You cover those crown and leaves to protect them with a light cloth, burlap, ground cloth, construction cloth. You don't need to cover the trunk. It'll be fine. You secure the tree in your truck or the back of your Subaru, what have you, your trailer, and you're trying to avoid it from rubbing and sliding all over the place. They can take a little bit of a beating, but you don't want them to. You don't need to move it like it's fine china, but move it like it's a piece of furniture that you don't want scratched up. When you're storing them, you don't want to pick up until you're ready to plant, because you don't want them sitting somewhere where they're going to be in the shade. Sometimes people get a plant and they leave them for a month in their yard before they plant them, and then they get eaten by local pests and rodents. They get accumulated or acclimated to different environments. So when you get them, when you get them, you want to plant them if you can within a week. Keep them in a cool and shady area so they don't get sun, bleached or stressed. Avoid those windy areas. Keep the roots wet. So we're going to go into planting instructions, and then after this, I'll take a break to see if there are any questions. I don't see any in the chat yet. So we've talked about how to choose a tree, where to get the tree, how to move a tree, and how do you put it in the ground. It is both simple and not simple. Yes, it is simple to dig a hole and put a tree in the ground. If that's all you want to do, then the tree might survive, but to do it well and have at least 80% or more success rate, there are specific things you want to do. What tools are you going to need? A shovel, if your ground is really hard, a mattock or pickaxe. This is especially pertinent if you're in an area or spud bar for a lot of our urban plantings near sidewalks or parks. Our ground has been compacted. You might need something a little beefier than a shovel. Sometimes an auger, which is basically a large spinning drill. Planting bar, which is that spud bar, if you're familiar with those, a large iron bar to break up compacted soil. A wire cutter and a knife, things for cutting the root ball. A mallet for driving in our states. Our tree protection, that'll be our cage, our deer cage, or our chicken wire, or our livestock wire. A tarp, we'll talk about why soon. Pruners, one can figure out why we want pruners. You'll want water, and you'll want mulch. It's not really that much. I know it kind of looks like a big list. You don't need everything on here, right? Depending on your soil. If your soil is super soft, you don't need an auger and a planting bar and a mattock. But you don't need much. When you're planting a tree, there's a right way and a wrong way to carry it. Just like there's a right way and a wrong way to carry a baby, right? Like there's a right way and a wrong way to carry a young tree. Do not carry the tree like this mysterious man on the left, who is carrying it by the trunk itself. This puts a lot of stress on the tree. That root ball has a lot of weight, a lot of moisture. It's going to stretch the roots. Think of it like carrying a person by their ponytail. That's not going to feel good, right? It's not healthy for the tree. It's going to stress fracture the wood. And it's a really great way for you to be carrying your tree along, you're planting your tree, and then it snaps and breaks. And you've spent all this time, and now you have a pot on the ground and a stick in your hand instead of a tree. What you do want to do is carry it like the woman on the right by the pot for our containerized pots. Most of the pots even have little indentations for your fingers to grab onto if you're getting it from a nursery stock. If you're moving a larger tree, like you can see over here on the right, use a tarp to carry it around, put it on a dolly, or roll it via the pot. Do what you can to avoid carrying it directly by the stem. Once you get it to where you're going by carrying it via the pot or the root ball, you're going to plant it by what's called the collar, the root collar. If it's burlap, you're going to cut your burlap back. Now, in the past, and some of you may have done this in the past, people actually left burlap on for their trees because the thought was it's biodegradable, the tree roots will just grow through it. That has been found to be actually very ineffective. It takes a long time for the burlap to biodegrade. Not all burlap is 100% organic. Sometimes it's used with plastic or it's treated. So it'll take a long time for it to biodegrade, and it'll deeply constrict those roots. Not only that, it acts as a moisture wicker away from the roots. So if you leave that burlap in the ground, it's going to pull water away from the roots and it's going to contain the roots. So it's really not going to set up for success. So you want to take that burlap off. You want to take the cage. If it has a burlap cage of metal around it, you want to take that cage off. Bare minimum, if you can't get all the burlap and the cage off, like you see on the far right upper line here, you want to at least take it off the top, at least take it off the top half. If you have to leave it on for some reason, the bottom is less essential, but give the tree space to breathe. Almost all of your plantings, as you can see here at the bottom too, you're going to want to move a decent amount of the top of the soil because you're going to want to find that root collar. Most nurseries, there'll just be a little bit too much dirt on top, and that's actually suffocating the tree. I'm sure you've heard about things like mulch volcanoes. We'll talk about that later. But just like a turtleneck, you don't want it to go above your chin. If dirt is up over the chin, you're like this for a tree. It's no good. You want the tree to be around its collar, or the soil to be around its collar. So just think of this as the neck of the tree. So you cut down to make sure you can find the root collar where those roots start splaying out, and it gets wider. Here's an example. You can see the root collar on the left. The root collar is not visible in the middle photo. So we had to dig down to where you can find it. I know it's a little hard to see in the photo, but we dug down a couple inches to where we can see the roots starting to come out of the tree, and it's starting to get a little wider. And we're finding that root collar to make sure that it's going to have the way for its roots to branch out and create stabilization. So also, the one downside we mentioned about containerized stock, they can get root bound. Luckily, you can go at this pretty intensely. It's common in a lot of trees, and I would say you're going to see it in your containerized trees. You want to break these roots apart pretty aggressively. You can do it by hand, or you can cut by cutting lines and circles across the roots. It's not going to harm the tree. It might set it back just a little bit, but these containerized stock have so many roots compared to other trees, compared to bare root or burlap, that they've got roots to spare. They actually need some of these roots to be taken out. And these ones that are going around in circles are going to keep going around in circles. Roots don't really change direction. If a root comes out from a tree this way, it's going to go that way for most of its life until it hits an obstacle. If a tree has root bound, it's going to just keep doing that until it eventually strangles itself. So it'll crush those xylem and phloem layers. So you got to cut it up. You can see here on the left, this has come out of the pot. You get a spade or a soil knife, and you cut lines down the same direction the tree is going into the ground. You can cut around 3 or 4 until your soil's looking nice and loose like this. You don't have to, like completely dissect and play operation. You just want to make sure that your soil's looking loose and you're not seeing any roots going around in circles. You loosen up those roots. This is an example of a long ago tree that is root bound, right? And you can see this tree, one, is probably 3 to 4 times smaller than it would be because it's been putting so much energy into fighting itself. And it's going to have a lot. This is a perfect area for a wound, right? This is where our fungus is going to get in. This is where our insects are going to get in. So these girdled roots, your tree might grow for a while, but it's going to take it down eventually. And it's going to grow a lot slower if you have these girdled roots. So once you've cut your roots, you got to decide how big to dig your hole. Pretty easy math. Measure the height of the root ball up to the root collar. That's about how big you're digging or deep you're digging your hole. It's pretty easy. You don't ever need to go much deeper than your root, whether it's containerized or bare root or burlap. You're going about from the from the root collar down to the bottom of wherever your soil or root base has, disintegrated. In terms of width, that's where we get a little bit more specific. You want your width to be around 2 to 3 times the width of the root in the root ball system. As we talked about in our lecture on how trees grow, right? They don't really grow with a taproot. It's all about that horizontal growth. So that's why you want to give them space, loose soil to grow horizontally. So you make sure that your hole is 2 to 3 times bigger than it would be. You need space to grow. When you're digging, the bottom of the hole should actually be pretty firm. You don't want it to be really loose because then after you leave, that tree will sink, it might tilt, it might lean, it might fall, and you're not going to have success. So you want the base of your hole to be relatively firm. You don't have to pack it. You also don't need to put in mulch or gravel. That's something people used to do in the past to help with drainage, but it doesn't actually add any more success. What it's doing when you have that drainage, the tree roots don't go down there for drainage anyway. It just holds water in those macro pores that we talked about in those large spaces. So you don't need to put any gravel or mulch at the bottom of the hole. And once again, you got to make sure when you have your tree in the hole at the top of that tree, or the top of that root ball, you're not burying that collar, and that you have enough space for that topsoil you're going to be putting back down on there, or that mulch. Make sure that, so sometimes that means it looks like you're planting the tree a little bit above ground before you put the dirt back. So here you can see another really common practice for urban tree planting is removing sod or a thick cover of grass. The grass is going to compete with the tree for water. Grass, even though it's small, is so good, you wouldn't believe, at sucking up water. If you've ever tried to, keep a grass watered in the summer or something like that, you know that. So taking this out, this is common practice. Even at reforestation projects where we're putting in 2,000 trees, we remove a foot of sod wherever we're planting, even that one little bare root the size of your finger, a foot diameter of sod, because it's such a big impact on the tree's success rate. So you want to remove that sod from over top. You don't want to flop it back down, which sometimes is tempting because it looks like it's always been there. You want to remove that grass so you're getting rid of that competition. This is also one that a lot of people don't know about, but I'm sure you've seen if you've dug a hole. The sides of your hole, especially with your shovel, like you can see on the left, can become really flat and hardened by the skimming of your shovel. This makes a really hard space for your small roots. If you remember our biology lecture, right? The roots that are actually doing the work are those hair-like roots, just the size of our hair. So they need small, light soil to go into. If you have a compacted clay soil edge like this, right, it's going to be really hard for your roots to break into. So in your hole, like you can see on the picture on the right, just scratch it up. Use your hand, use the edge of your shovel, use a stick, scratch it up so those roots can have better success getting in. Because otherwise, if you have a perfectly smooth hole all the way around, you're basically putting it back in a pot. You need it to have aeration, you need it to have soil. Speaking of soil, I said bring a tarp. You said, why do we need a tarp? Well, one of the more helpful things to do is keep your soil. Put it on a tarp or put it in the pot that you took your tree out of. You're going to have to rebury that tree, and the best success it's going to have is going to be with the soil that it's going to grow in. So you're going to put that soil back into the hole. You're going to use it to backfill that hole. You might need soil from somewhere else, but keep that soil, use as much of it as you can. If you just put it on the dirt, you usually use at least a quarter or more of your soil just down amongst the grass and the leaves. And then you're going to be short on soil. So dig it into the pot, put it on a tarp, what have you, save yourself a lot of work in the future. This is an example of moving one of these larger burlap trees into a hole. You see that they've cleared the sod away. They're cutting the burlap off. They're taking the cage off, and they're going to put it in. Because it's so large, they're also leaning it, right? They're being very gentle with it, not to stress fracture the trunk or anything like that. You can see now they didn't put it on a tarp, but they have a collection of the soil they're going to backfill with. The natural soil that's growing in that area is going to have its highest success. Like I said, you're backfilling. You want to take off everything, center the tree in the hole, make sure it's relatively straight. It's not going to be perfect, but make sure it's relatively straight. Break up any large clumps. As you can see on the left photo, you still have those large clumps. On the right, just break them up with your hand or your shovel or your foot. You add the water as you backfill, and then you double check that your root collar is not buried. And you make sure that's a little packed. I like to do something called the wiggle test, where if you get your tree and you just slightly wiggle it, when you wiggle it, you want to make sure your soil's packed enough that everything's moving together and you don't just see the tree moving. You see the soil that it's planted in moving, that's packed enough that everything kind of moves like this instead of just the tree wobbling loosely. You don't want to be able to tell the soil from the soil that you bought from the soil that you refilled with. You want to be able to, it's all mixed together. All right. Common question. I don't know if this is one of the ones in the chat. Okay, I don't think so, but I'll answer this shortly. Should I fertilize or use compost? What do you guys think? It's kind of a tricky question. Actually, we don't suggest it. If you're gardening, compost and fertilizer, great. If you're planting 5, 20, 200 trees, that's a lot of fertilizer. That is a lot of compost. And the amount that you're going to be able to amend with your soil is going to be really small. And that tree is going to use it up in about a year or two. So if you're planting a tree and you're putting in fertilizer or compost and you're doing your due diligence, that means you need to go back every year or two and give it more fertilizer or compost. So if you're only planting one tree in your yard, that's fine. You can amend the soil with fertilizer or compost. But it's just not practical if you're doing a tree planting for an entire community to amend your soil. And it's not necessarily going to be done forever, right? You want them to get acclimated to the soil they're growing in. Mulch, one of our last topics before we take a break, and I'll do some questions. Mulch is important. We don't want mulch volcanoes, right? We'll talk about that. Mulch holds down water, it shades out the weeds, protects from temperature swings, hot and cold, it adds organic matter. There are a lot of different types. You can use wood chips, shredded hardwood, pine bark, but you want to avoid dyed mulches. They don't hold water as well. They're more pest prone. So avoid those dyed red, dyed black mulches if you can. Get something that's just bare wood. And a lot of times you can get it from something called like chip drop. Arborists, road crews, when they're clearing trees, they got to put their stuff somewhere. So you can get it for free, usually from your county government. Aha, right? Our mulch volcano. So for any of you that don't know the term mulch volcano, it's the tree on the right. You see these all the time. It's like when you learn a new word, you hear it all the time. Once you know what a tree volcano is, anytime you go driving anywhere, you're going to see them in every shopping center. Drives us crazy. Slowly, the industry is starting to learn not to do this, but it's an uphill battle. Happy tree, sad tree, right? Sad tree is when you're burying it in mulch. Not only does this start to suffocate the tree, if the mulch is up there for too long, the tree will start to put roots out into the mulch instead of the ground. And if that mulch is ever removed, that tree will die because the roots are now prioritizing up in the mulch. If that mulch is, if the roots do go into that mulch, it's going to starve. It's not going to get enough water. It's not going to get enough nutrients. So it's just when landscaping companies usually come back every year and to cover more mulch with mulch to keep the weeds down. But it should be pulled away from the tree. If anything, mulch should be more like a blanket than a pillow, right? You want it to be spread out like we see on this happy tree. And around the base of the tree, you really don't need much at all. You clear it away. So we have that 3 by 3 by 3 rule. In the center 3 inches, you don't have any mulch. Then 3 feet around it, you have about 3 inches of mulch. So 3 inches of mulch for 3 feet with the 3 inches immediately around the trunk with no mulch. So the 3 by 3 by 3. So the different types of mulch, you can get wood chips, large, chunky. Usually they want to be dry. Try to avoid if it's very fresh because it takes longer to decompose. Let it age a little bit if you can. It may contain other things like bits of bark and leaves. That's fine. It's a good way to avoid seeds and weeds and invasives if you have another mulch that has different things in it. It does break down slower than shredded mulch because it's bigger pieces, and it doesn't mat down as quickly if you're worried about aesthetics or walking around. Then we have our shredded mulch, which is what most people think of when we say mulch. It's the most classic one. It's easy to find, breaks down in a year or two. The nutrients go into the soil pretty quick. You do have to replace it more often if you're keeping it mulched. It holds a lot of water, which means the bags are quite heavy compared to the other ones, but it does knit together quite well. It keeps weeds out, and it can prevent, if it's too knit together, it can prevent rain from entering, but you can break it apart as needed. One that's becoming more popular, especially around buildings, cedar or pine bark or mini nuggets. It lasts longer and it's less pest resistant. If you're planting near a house, especially a wooden house, we recommend cypress or cedar chips because they're more pest resistant for things like termites near a historic home. They do hold less water. They break down a little bit more slowly because that wood, like cedar or cypress, is meant to break down more slowly. That's why they're designed, or that's why they're being sold like this. A benefit though is that they are lightweight, they're easier to carry. But if you do get a really heavy rain, or if you're on a hill, these softwood or pine bark ones can float away much more easily. Watering, the biggest thing about keeping trees alive, right? 3 to 5 years of maintenance at least. Water is critical for those first 3 years. You got to water it as soon as it gets in the ground. Whether it's containerized and B, those two need the most, or bare root, you still got to water it. It just needs a little less. You got to water it from spring to fall, otherwise known as a growing season. Spring, summer, fall. You got to water it that whole time. Check on it, usually during the first summer for sure. The first year during the growing season, water it once a week. By the second year, check on it, maybe more close to once a month or anytime there's a dry spell. Any day that's really low and you know the soil's dried out, also depending on if you're on a slope or how much your soil drains. Check to see if your soil's wet. When you water it, at least 1.5 gallons of water for the diameter of the tree, and keep it within the drip line. If you remember, the drip line is basically your mulch circle where water would drip off of the tips of the leaves. All right, tree and shrub protection. I'm going to take a break before we get into the protection and check my chat. Okay, so how do you store bare root seedlings if you keep them for a couple days? Can they be kept in water, and for how long? It's a great question. Bare roots are often stored in walk-in refrigerators in the industry that they're actually from. So if you have a large fridge or a very cool space, you can keep your bare roots in a cool space like a root cellar. You can keep them in water. I would not keep them in water for any longer than 3 days. Even then, you're going to start to get a risk of oversaturation and molding. If you're going to store them, a cool, dark place with a damp, like paper towel or damp cloth around them. And you can store them in a cool, dark place for up to a month if you have the right temperature. All of the bare root trees I have gotten soaked in hydrogel, and roots are kept in a clear trash bag and watered daily until planted within 7 days. Not sure if seedlings are different. Yeah, so a lot of times hydrogel is a substance that's added to a lot of our trees. There are different chemical formulations of it to hold water. If you get them from like the Arbor Day Foundation, they'll usually be dipped in hydrogel and they can last longer that way. How do you plant bare root trees when they have long roots? It's best not to cut the roots. So I'm imagining, Tom, you're talking about when you get a bare root tree and it seems to have this long taproot. You want to dig as best you can as long as that root is. If you cut that main root when the tree is very young, then it's going to set it back pretty hard. It's not like our containerized stock where you have an excess of roots. You really don't want to cut any roots with bare roots. Why are many of these pictures showing trees planted straight in rows rather than randomly as in nature? Jerry, that is a good question. We do that because when you're planting 100 trees at a time, you need to have some type of method to get them planted, and because we have maintenance, especially our reforestation or these trees you see here, we need maintenance requirements for a lawnmower to get in and out. And it's just not practical for a tree planting over 50 trees usually to be planted naturally as they would be in a forest. But here's an interesting thing. After about 10 years, when you go into a forest that's been properly planted, we're not talking about a pine plantation, you won't be able to tell. Because after the first 3 years, we stop doing maintenance. So the area in between those rows fill in with volunteers. So our reforestation projects actually grow into a completely healthy forest based off of the trees that die and based off of the volunteers that fill those areas in. But for practical reasons, we have them in those straight rows for maintenance. Best way to keep tree plugs alive for several months over the winter. Yes, in a cool area around 45 degrees, not down to freezing. 1.5 gallon diameter, is that a half gallon per inch in diameter? So by diameter for our half gallon, really you want 1.5 gallon as a rule of thumb for any tree you're watering if it's containerized stock. If you're doing that 3 to 15 gallon, 1.5 is a good rule of thumb. If you're going outside of that, then yes, you're doing that equation of 1.5 gallons per inch in diameter. But an easy rule of thumb for any tree you're going to plant is about 1.5 gallons. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to some more of the maintenance and protection? Let me do a little time check here. Actually, can someone just put in the chat what time it is? Because I can't close my screen to see it.
It's 7:13, Edward.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenna. 7:13. All right. So we still got some time to cook here. So trees and shrub protection. Let's move on. So those reforestation plantings you can see in our planting tubes on the left. This is a good time to remove this shelter on the left. On the right, this is a bad time to remove this shelter. These shelters have to be taken off eventually. They're there to protect the trees for the first 3 to 5 years. If the tree grows up and explodes out of it like this, then that tree is not going to have healthy success, right? It's doing all this growth, it's shooting up and growing way too tall, way too fast. It's going to be hard to remove. So you want to remove your shelter if you're doing a reforestation. Over here on the left, when we see this maple, where it's just started to peek out of the top, that's the time to take your shelter off, take your stakes out. And we do this with all of our reforestations. We go and we take these shelters off and we take these stakes out. Most of the stakes by that time are mostly been close to decomposing. We use hardwood stakes. You don't need pressure treated or anything like that. You can do some pruning when you're doing a planting, especially if you're doing an urban planting. Don't need to do a lot. Prune off any broken branches that happens during shipping or transportation of planting. Make a nice clean cut to avoid infestation. Prune off any of the dead branches. And if you're really feeling like you want to make sure it has good success, give it that primary growth. Give it one shoot, not two, that's going to be at the top. When you're making your cut, you cut outside the branch collar, like we talked about. You can see our collar here with our blue arrow where it's swelling up and larger. You cut at this yellow line when you're trimming outside your collar, so you don't cut the actual base of the tree and cause a wound. You cut outside here for it to be able to heal over. Try not to leave long stubs. That's just excess wood for an infection of mold to get in. And when you cut close to this collar, the meristems, if you remember the meristems being those basically that cell tissue, that stem cell tissue by that collar, will heal over right at the base here once this wood dies back. An example of how to cut for primary or apical or apical growth, prune to have one central leader. So you can see here on the left, we have a leader probably that died back in the past. So now this tree is 3 potential directions it could go. So if we see this on a tree, we want to cut to choose one and cut to give it success. So you can see we'd cut the branch on the lower left here and on the upper right so that we have one main leader going to the top. If you're doing a planting of 50 or more trees, you don't have to do this. I don't do this on my plantings, as you can imagine, where I'm putting in 150 trees in a day. There's no time. But when you're doing a smaller tree planting where every tree counts more, it's right in front of someone's home or on a sidewalk or an important cemetery or church property, and the tree itself is of higher impact than many trees, that's when you're going to trim to make sure it has more success. All right, planting recap. Make sure that you stake your trees. You remove that burlap sack. If it's a burlap sack, you cut that root ball. Install your tree protection, those cages that whether it's deer fence or landscape cloth. Remove your tags and your ties from the tree so they don't become embedded in the tree later on. Remove, a lot of times people tie with hoses. You can see here on the right. So while you remove those ties, they become embedded and then it's just a big old wound waiting to happen. It's a failure point. Keep the mulch away from the base of your tree. Gently backfill, make sure the bottom of your foundation is firm. If you follow all of these steps, the Arborist Society of America has found that you have 80% chance survival with watering in the first year. That's really high. So you want to follow all of these steps. Maintenance. Now, this is in the documents. You can take a screenshot or you can, I put it up here as an example, not that you have to copy down every single word, but you can follow specific maintenance schedules. So you can see here on the timeline, you have things to do when planting, how much water, mulch, if you're doing the trunk, how do you protect it, if you stake it. It's a little sheet to tell you what to do. The years 1 to 3 and 4 to 5, and then after 10 years. After 10 years, you can see there's really not much. After 4, even there's not much. It's really those first 3 years. So the maintenance keeps that weed reduction down. So all of our plantings for the first 3 years, we guarantee maintenance. And we do that by having crews come out to cut the grass at least twice a year, keep that competition down during the growing season. You water as we said, from spring to fall in year 1, check every few days, water at least once a week. By year 3 or 2 to 3, you can go back to once a month or when it's needed. And then after 3, they're going to mostly get established. Do it when there's a drought, but otherwise you probably won't need it. Maintain that mulch to maintain, also help you keep the weeds down. Remove the stakes after 1 year. You won't need the stakes, even if it's a plug. You can take the single stake in your tree shelter off, or the 2 or 4 stakes and your cage off for the deer. You can take those off. They've been in the ground long enough that they're sturdy. Check on the health and safety. Check up on your trees. That's what our riparian rangers and our tree stewards often do. They go and they check and see how trees are doing. Prune some of those dead branches. If you have dead, it's much easier to prune a tree when it's 6 feet tall than when it's 60 feet tall, and you need to hire a crew and spend thousands of dollars. So think about cutting that branch when it's the size of a pencil instead of when it's the size of a canoe. And then you prune into the future every 3 to 5 years as needed, which might mean never. That tree might not need pruning. So at 7:20, 10 minutes to, I see I've got 2 questions. Aren't the stakes helping protect from deer? Can we leave them? Let's see. Can we leave them on, but add holes for branches till the tree is safe from girdling? So those tubes, I imagine you're talking about those 2 tubes. Yes, they're protecting them from deer. But once they're tall enough, they're ideally going to be thick enough that they're not going to have too much predation by deer. That might have a little bit of topping, but it's unlikely. We plant, if anything, you can remove those shelters, and with the reforestation for the tubes, we can lose some. As we said, we want that naturalized look eventually. So if you're planting 2,000 trees, you can lose 100. So that's okay, but the deer won't have a bigger impact than that. That's why for our urban trees, in that image we had here, let me go up. Oh, where was I? Aha, there it is. You can see that's why with most of our urban plantings, we use our cages because they can stay on longer and they protect from the deer and they don't inhibit the growth of the tree. We don't do this with our reforestation plantings. Let's see, they talked about the deer. Shouldn't most larger branches be pruned using 3 cuts and not a single cut to avoid stripping the tree? Yes, if you are doing a larger tree, any tree that you are probably going to be planting, you do not use a 3-cut method. It's small enough, you can just use hand pliers and that's just fine, based off of the size of the tree. You really only need to do that when the size of the branch is starting to get around the size of, I don't know, not quite the size of your arm, but when it's at least maybe 1 inch in diameter. And most of the trees you're going to be transplanting aren't going to be that size. But anything larger than that, definitely in arboriculture, you do 3. If a tree species by Eric likes to grow as a multi-stem bush, this is a good question, and that fits our planting purpose. Is it fine to let it do so? Is it healthier to prune to a central leader? I was just going to say, Service Berry specifically hoping to plant Serviceberry, mwah, beautiful, love it. It's one of the ones I plant the most. And yes, it's multi-stemmed. Absolutely okay to leave it multi-stemmed. Anytime you're planting something like a serviceberry, maybe sometimes even a fringe tree is multi-stemmed, or witch hazel, these lower tree shrub kind of gray area, leave them multi-stemmed. It's only when it's a proper tree, quote unquote, right? That it would usually grow as one stem, that you keep it as one stem. Stanford, can you comment on beavers and trees planted and riparian embankments? Can I comment on beavers? Yes, beavers are cool. I'm guessing you want more than that. So when you're planting on riparian embankments, you're probably saying, like, should you let beavers go at it? That's a complex question. So one of the most common ways to do riparian plantings, or two of the most common ways, I should say, to do riparian plantings are live staking and plugs. If you're putting in plugs, it's a lower number, and I would usually put shelters around your trees to prevent from beavers, at least for the beginning. But beavers are they're like taxes. They're one of those things in life that they're gonna win. They're gonna get you in the long run. Unless you chop it and move it out, but we're not a huge fan of that because most ecosystems, beavers are being productive, and we want to work them back into an ecosystem in a healthy way. If it's on your private land, you can do what you want, but we would usually put a tube or a cage around that tree. Same thing for the first 3 to 5 years, then you hope the beaver doesn't choose it. If we're live staking, which is where you have a tree that can sprout by cutting, which we didn't talk about here today. It has to be in a very wet area, mostly with things like willow or river birch. Live staking, we actually just inundate the beaver. We do like an R and K selected species approach, where if you put in, 6,000 sticks or 500 sticks, depending on the area, you put in more live stakes than the beaver can handle. So that's a good question. We haven't really come across a beaver destroying one of our riparian plantings ever. Sometimes they cure a few things here or there, but they've never actually had a major impact on any of our riparian plantings. Awesome. Are there any other questions? Okay, it doesn't look like it. Hopefully we're about 5 minutes ahead. I hope you guys will enjoy the snow. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. We just have one more where you get to see all of the lovely 5 faces that we turn on our cameras. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Feel free to follow up with questions via email. And yeah, go enjoy the winter, and I'll see you next week. Happy evening, everybody.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.